Hi everyone, today we're going to be reviewing the American Pageant, Chapter 10, launching in the new ship of state, the Washington and Adams administrations. The United States was going rapidly during this time period, with the population doubling every 25 years, and the census in 1790 recording 4 million people. Cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, and Baltimore blossomed, but the majority of America's population was still 90% rural, all but 5% living east of the Appalachian Mountains, and overflow concentrated in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Washington was unanimously drafted as president by the Electoral College in 1789. He is the only presidential nominee to ever receive every vote, the only one who did not in some way angle for the office, and he was more of a strength of character person rather than a politician. This picture shows how people revered and were in awe of Washington as the father of his country. The journey from Mount Vernon to New York City was triumphal. He took the oath on April 30th, 1789, and he shaped the new government by first creating the cabinet. The Constitution did not mention a cabinet. It merely provided that the president may require written opinions. At first, only 3 full-fledged department heads served under the president: Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of War Henry Knox. The original Constitution did not guarantee individual rights such as freedom of religion or trial by jury. Some states ratified the Constitution only with the understanding that these would be added. So the new Bill of Rights was crafted and topped at the list of imperatives facing the new government. The amendments could be proposed in 2 ways: by constitutional convention requested by 2/3 of the states, or by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. James Madison determined that he would draft the amendments himself, and so he largely wrote the Bill of Rights and then guided them through Congress. And the Bill of Rights was adopted in 1791 and safeguarded some of the most precious American principles, such as freedom of religion, speech and press, the right to bear arms, the right to trial by jury, the right to assemble and petition government for redress, and the Bill of Rights also prohibited cruel and unusual punishment and arbitrary government seizure of private property. Madison inserted the 9th Amendment, specifying that certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. To reassure states' writers, he included the 10th Amendment, which reserves all rights not explicitly delegated or prohibited by the federal Constitution to the states or the people. The amendments swung Federalist pendulum back into an anti-Federalist direction. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was next passed, and it organized the Supreme Court with the Chief Justices and 5 Associate Justices. The federal district and circuit courts established the Office of Attorney General, and John Jay became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Hamilton's role in the new government was to create public credit and to construct an economy for the United States. So Hamilton worked to correct the economic problems of the Articles of Confederation. He crafted fiscal policies that favored the wealthy to gain needed monetary and political support for the country. He sought to bolster the national credit first, urging Congress to fund the entire national debt at par, and also urging them to assume completely the debts incurred by the states during the Revolution. Funding at par meant the federal government would pay its debts at face value plus accumulated interest to total $54 million. Because people believed that this was impossible, the bonds depreciated to 10 or 15 cents on the dollar. Congress passed Hamilton's measure in 1790. Hamilton urged Congress to assume the states' debts as well, totaling $21.5 million, arguing that the state debts from the Revolution were a national obligation. He believed that assumption would chain the states more tightly to the federal chariot. It would shift the attachment of the wealthy creditors from the states to the federal government. States with heavy debts like Massachusetts were thrilled by Hamilton's proposal. States who had already paid off their debts, like Virginia, very much opposed it. While Virginia did not want the state debts assumed, it did want the proposed federal capital to be on the Potomac River. So a compromise was made in 1790. Hamilton got his national bank, while Jefferson and the South got their capital in Washington. The new government was dangerously overloaded, with the national debt reaching $75 million. Hamilton, who was called the father of the national debt, was not worried. He believed that within limits, the national debt was a national blessing because it gave creditors a stake in the success of the government. He raised money from customs duties on foreign trade. So the first tariff was passed in 1789, and it imposed an 8% tax on the value of dutiable imports. The main goal was to raise revenue, protect the infant industries in the United States, and Hamilton, who was very supportive of manufacturing and wanting an industrial revolution, urged more protection for these manufacturing groups. Congress voted only 2 slight increases in the tariff during Washington's presidency. Hamilton also sought additional revenue through an excise tax in 1791 on some domestic items, notably whiskey. This levy of 7 cents a gallon would be borne by distillers who lived in the back country, where whiskey flowed so freely on the frontier that it was used for money. Hamilton proposed the Bank of the United States, taking his model from the Bank of England. He wanted it to be a powerful private institution with the government as a major stockholder, where the Treasury would deposit its surplus money. Federal funds would stimulate business by remaining in circulation, and it would provide a stable national currency by printing money. Jefferson vehemently opposed the bank, insisting that there was no specific authorization in the Constitution. He believed that all powers not specifically granted to the central government were reserved to the states, as it says in Amendment 10. He concluded that only the states, not Congress, had the power to charter banks, and he was a proponent of the concept of strict construction. Hamilton, at Washington's request, prepared a brilliant reply to Jefferson. Jefferson believed that what the Constitution did not permit, it forbade. Hamilton believed that what the Constitution did not forbid, it permitted. He used the clause that Congress may pass any laws necessary and proper to carry out powers vested in the government agencies. This is called the Elastic Clause. Congress was empowered to collect taxes. Congress was empowered to regulate trade as well. Therefore, according to Hamilton, a national bank was necessary. The implied powers from loose construction of the Constitution made it so. Hamilton's financial views prevailed. Washington signed the bank measure into law. The biggest support for the bank came from commercial and the financial centers of the North, while the strongest opposition arose from the agricultural South. The Bank of the United States is created in 1791, chartered for 20 years, allowed capital of $10 million, which was 20% owned by the federal government, and was located in Philadelphia. The Whiskey Rebellion is our next issue. This flared in southwestern Pennsylvania when Hamilton levied his excise tax on whiskey. The defiant distillers cried liberty and no excise. This was a big challenge for the national government, and Washington, in response, summoned the militias and went down to western Pennsylvania with them himself. When the troops reached western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Boys dispersed. This action strengthened the new national government and showed that it could enforce its laws. This is a political cartoon that you may see in regards to the Whiskey Rebellion. The cartoonist clearly favored the Pennsylvania rebels who resisted Hamilton's imposition of an excise tax on whiskey. Hamilton's schemes encroached sharply upon states' rights. An organized opposition began to build as a result, which became a full-blown political rivalry. National political parties were unknown to America when Washington took his inaugural oath, and the founders had really not envisioned permanent political parties. The two-party system has existed in the United States ever since this time. Their competition for power has proved to be indispensable to sound democracy, and the party out of power has provided balance, ensuring that politics never goes too far in one direction. This is the evolution of the major political parties, beginning with the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. Pause the video and you can review it. Now there were two major political parties. the Democratic Republicans, and Hamilton's Federalists. In Washington's second term, the foreign policy issues escalated the differences between the two. It started with the French Revolution in 1789, which would destabilize Europe for the next 26 years. This is a picture of the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette, 1793. Americans initially supported the French Revolution, but then they feared the radicalism and mob rule of the revolution. Few non-American events have left deeper scars on American political and social life than the French Revolution. Early stages were very peaceful. They tried to place constitutional restrictions on the king. 1792, France declares war on Austria. News later reached America that France had proclaimed itself a republic, and Americans were very enthusiastic because they supported the revolution, because they remembered and likened it to the American Revolution. This is a picture of the storming of the Bastille in 1789, which signaled the outbreak of the French Revolution. The key to the Bastille itself was given from Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington and actually hangs in Mount Vernon in Virginia to this day. The king was beheaded in 1793, and the head-rolling reign of terror began. Earlier battles had not affected America directly, but once Britain was drawn into the conflict, ripples began to spread to the New World. Since 1688, every major European war has involved a duel for control of the Atlantic Ocean. So Washington is going to try to remain neutral, but he has to deal with the French-American alliance of 1778 first. This initially bound the United States to help the French defend the West Indies. It was a Democratic Republicans who were honoring the alliance because they supported France, saying that America owed France its freedom and it was time to pay the debt. Washington believed that war must be avoided at all costs. He tried to play for time, which improved America's strength, and that was the cardinal policy of the Founding Fathers. Both Hamilton and Jefferson agreed, and Washington shortly thereafter issued the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 after the war with England and France began. In the Neutrality Proclamation, he proclaimed official neutrality in the widening conflict. He warned citizens to be impartial towards both armed camps. This was America's first formal declaration, proved to be enormously controversial. The pro-French Jeffersonians were enraged, while the pro-British Federalists were very much heartened by the decision. The debate intensified when Edmond Genet, a representative of the French Republic, landed in Charleston, South Carolina. He was swept away by the reception from the Jeffersonians and decided that the Neutrality Proclamation did not reflect popular opinion. So he embarked on a non-neutral activity not authorized by the French alliance to gain support for France. Washington demands Genet's withdrawal. The Neutrality Proclamation illustrates the truism that self-interest is basic in the cement of alliances, which means in 1778, both France and America stood to gain from their alliance. But in 1793, only France did. So technically, Americans did not flout their obligation because France never officially asked them to honor it. But France needed America as a neutral source of food for the West Indies. The policy of neutrality was sorely tried by the British. They had kept a chain of northern posts on U.S. soil in defiance of the 1783 peace treaty. London was reluctant to abandon the lucrative fur trade, and London also hoped to build an Indian buffer state while selling firearms and alcohol to the Miami Confederacy. This caused problems with the Native Americans as well. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, General Anthony Wayne routed the Miamis. After the British refused to shelter those fleeing the battle, the Miami Confederacy offered to make peace with General Wayne. This is the area where the American posts that were held by the British and the British-American clashes took place after 1783. In the Treaty of Grenville, signed in 1795, the Miamis... beginning the slide over. In the Treaty of Grenville, the Miamis surrendered vast tracts of the Old Northwest. In exchange, they received $20,000 and an annual annuity of $9,000. They kept the right to hunt the lands they ceded. They hoped for recognition of sovereign status, but felt it put some limits on the ability of the United States to decide the fate of the Indian people. The British seized 300 American merchant ships, impressed scores of seamen into naval service, and threw hundreds into foul dungeons. These actions incensed Americans. War with the world's mightiest commercial empire would undermine Hamilton's financial system, and people worried about this. Washington decided to send Chief Justice John Jay to London in 1794. The Jeffersonians were dismayed by the selection of the noted Federalist, but Jay's negotiations were sabotaged by Hamilton. Jay won a few concessions in Jay's treaty. The British concessions of the treaty were that they promised to evacuate the forts on U.S. soil. They consented to pay damages for past seizures of American ships. The British stopped short of pledging. They did not pledge no future maritime seizures or impressments or ending the supply of arms to Native Americans. Jay's unpopular pact vitalized the newborn Democratic Republican Party and was seen as a betrayal by the South. Even Washington's popularity was hurt by controversy over the treaty. There were other consequences. Fearing an Anglo-American alliance, Spain offered to deal favorably to the United States, and so Spain signs Pinckney's Treaty in 1795, granting the United States free navigation of the Mississippi, warehouse rights at the port of New Orleans, and the territory of western Florida. Washington at this point decided to retire because he was exhausted from diplomatic and partisan battles. This decision established a strong two-term tradition for later presidents. In his farewell address of 1796, which was never delivered orally, just printed in newspapers, he strongly advised the young nation to avoid permanent alliances, favoring temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. Washington's contributions were that the federal government was solidly established after his presidency, and he kept the nation out of both overseas entanglement and foreign wars. When Washington left office in 1797, he was showered with brickbats of partisan abuse in contrast to the bouquets that greeted him on his arrival. Adams, with the support of New England, won by a narrow margin of 71 to 68 in the Electoral College. Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, became vice president. Adams was a stubborn man of stern principles, tactless and prickly intellectual aristocrat, and had no appeal to the masses. His other handicaps were that he was stepping into Washington's shoes, which no successor could hope to fill. Hamilton hated him, and most ominous of all, Adams inherited a violent quarrel with France. The French were infuriated by Jay's treaty. They condemned it as a step toward an alliance with Great Britain, assailed it as a flagrant violation of the Franco-American Treaty of 1778. French warships, in retaliation, seized defenseless American merchant vessels. There were 300 by mid-1797, and the Paris regime refused to receive America's newly appointed envoy and even threatened to arrest him. Adams tried to reach agreement with the French. He appointed a diplomatic commission of 3 men, including John Marshall, who would be the future Chief Justice. The envoys reached Paris in 1797, where they hoped to meet with Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Secretly approached by 3 go-betweens, later referred to as X, Y, and Z, they demanded a loan of 32 million florins, plus a bribe of $25,000, for the privilege of merely talking with Talleyrand. This political cartoon is often connected to the XYZ affair. It shows an innocent young America being plundered by Frenchmen as John Bull looks on in amusement from the English Channel. The terms were intolerable and negotiations collapsed. Marshall, on his reaching New York in 1798, was hailed as a hero for his steadfastness. The XYZ affair incited anger throughout the United States, and a popular slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," was heard among political circles. War preparations began, pushed at a feverish pace despite the opposition by the Jeffersonians in Congress. The Naval Department was created, and the 3-ship Navy was expanded. The Marine Corps was reestablished, and a new army of 10,000 men was authorized but not fully raised. The war itself was an undeclared naval war, confined to sea, mainly the West Indies. 2.5 years of undeclared hostilities. American privateers and men of war captured 80 French vessels. Several hundred Yankee merchant ships were lost to the enemy. Only a slight push, it seemed, might plunge both nations into full-scale war. France did not want war. Facing many European foes, Talleyrand saw little benefit in fighting the United States. Let it be known that if the Americans would send a new minister, he would be received with proper respect. American envoys found things better when they reached Paris in 1800. Napoleon Bonaparte had recently seized dictatorial power. In the convention of 1800, France agreed to annul the 22-year-old alliance. The U.S. agreed to pay damage claims of the shippers. Adams deserves immense credit for the belated push for peace. He smoothed the path for the peaceful purchase of Louisiana 3 years later under the Jefferson administration. Federalist actions to muffle the Jeffersonians at this time period took aim at pro-Jefferson aliens. The first act, called the Alien Act, was passed and raised the residency requirement from 5 years to 14 years, which violated the traditional policy of speedy assimilation. Under the second law, the president could deport dangerous foreigners in time of peace and imprison them in time of war. This was an arbitrary grant of executive power and was never really enforced. The Sedition Act slapped at two freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment, freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, saying anyone who impeded the policy of the government or falsely defamed its officials would be liable to fines or imprisonment. Many Jeffersonian editors were indicted under it. 10 of them were brought to trial and convicted. The Sedition Act seemed to conflict with the Constitution. In fact, it was in direct violation of the First Amendment. The Federalists had manipulated anti-French hysteria, and Jefferson feared a possible slide to a one-party dictatorship. This is a picture of Matthew Lyon, his fight in Congress with the Federalist Representative Roger Griswold over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson secretly penned a series of resolutions, for the Virginia Resolution, penned by Madison, and the Kentucky Resolution, penned by Jefferson. Jefferson's was approved by the Kentucky legislature in 1798 and 1799. Madison drafted the similar but less extreme statement adopted by the Virginia legislature in 1798. Both stressed the social compact theory, which was popular among English political philosophers of the time period, and was the concept that 13 states, in creating the federal government, had entered into a compact regarding its jurisdiction, and the nation was the creation of the states. The states were thus the final judges of whether their creation had broken the compact by overstepping authority granted it. Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions concluded that the federal regime had exceeded its constitutional powers, and in regard to the Alien and Sedition Acts, nullification or a refusal to accept them was the rightful remedy. No other state legislatures fell into line. Federalist states added ringing condemnations. They argued that the people, not the states, had made the original compact, and it was up to the Supreme Court, not the states, to nullify unconstitutional legislation passed by Congress. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were a brilliant formulation of extreme states' rights view regarding the Union, more sweeping in implications than the authors had additionally intended. Later, they were used to support nullification and ultimately secession. Neither Jefferson nor Madison had any intention of breaking the Union. They wanted to preserve it. As the presidential contest of 1800 approached, differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans sharply were etched in stone. Conflicts over domestic politics and foreign policy undermined unity of the Revolutionary era. The Federalists supported strong central government, loose interpretation of the Constitution, and commerce. The Democratic Republicans supported states' rights, strict interpretation of the Constitution, and agriculture. Hamiltonians believed that the wealthy and well-educated should run the government. Jeffersonians believed that the common person, if educated, could manage public affairs. Would fragile and battered American ship of state founder on the rocks of controversy? This was the question as we entered the election of 1800. And this is the chronology from the chapter, which will help you put all of the events into chronological order.